So now we're going to go over the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. This motor division pretty much is divided into the autonomic and somatic. The autonomic is auto control of itself, and this is done intrinsically within your body. And basically what it does, it just carries motor impulses to the smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, as well as the glands. Those things you cannot control. On the somatic end, it carries voluntary, because all your skeletal muscles have a voluntary control. It means you have the power of controlling them whenever we want to. So the main difference between autonomic and somatic is one is voluntary while the other one is involuntary. One is autonomic, the other one is fully controllable. So most of the functions are unconscious. We call that visceral reflexes, like the peristalsis, respiration, the movement of your diaphragm, the contraction of your heart, the constriction of the sphincter of Oddi, relaxation, etc. All those smooth muscles inside, as well as movement of your stomach. And on the somatic nervous system is mostly conscious, and again, it's mainly skeletal muscles. So those reflexes, right, we produce a simple or a complex reflex. So you have reflexes which are either voluntary or involuntary. So you have reflexes. So you have reflexes that are visceral or somatic reflexes. So reflexes you have in visceral or somatic. Somatic, we said, is through the skeletal muscles, and visceral is within your body. So these reflexes can actually be, or most of the time, it's an involuntary response. So the somatic reflex results from the contraction of skeletal muscles. That's the step number one, which we see here a picture of somebody tapping on a glass bottle, and that it's pretty much sending the reflex all the way to the spinal cord, and you're retrieving the foot from the glass. The other one is the autonomic or visceral reflex, and again, this is just in a visceral receptor. So you have your receptors, chemoreceptors, pain receptors, pressure receptors, baroreceptors. So those comes basically from your vagus nerve, so which is an example of a baroreflex. So a baroreflex means pressure, and then here we are controlling the blood pressure. So step one, whenever your heart is pumping a lot of blood out and that amount of blood oversees the 120, so a hypertension, so it sends this baroreceptor found on your aortic arch and common carotid, it sends this high blood pressure, so it stimulates your glossopharyngeal nerve, and that will transmit a signal to the medulla oblongata, which at the same time will get your vagus nerve to transmit an inhibitory signal on the cardiac pacemaker. So when you send an inhibitory into the cardiac pacemaker, your heart rate decreases and the blood pressure should be decreased as well. That's the example of your reflex. Now, the somatic reflex, it's an example of your spinal reflex. So again, somatic is the outer part, is the skeletal muscle, is the voluntary one. So this spinal reflex that we have here tend to be involuntary, motor response to a stimuli, but the actual reflex arc is shown below, which is pain sensation by the Meissner's or Pacini receptor, so the pain, touch, and temperature. That sends a sensory input, afferent fibers into the dorsal aspects of the spinal cord segment, all the way to the dorsal root ganglion, into the interneuron, which is number 3, and then this is a short reflex arch, which it does not include the brain, and it comes out as a single motor output, which is an efferent fiber all the way to your skeletal muscles. So let's do these. Let's do a spinal reflex. So step number 1, we have a stimuli, which is a receptor. This is a pain receptor. You step on a nail, sharp nail, So you have a rival stimulate to that receptor that is a pain receptor found on the Meissner's corpuscles at the level of the integumentary system, so in your skin. And there's an activation of that receptor that sends a sensory stimuli, creating an action potential that travels all the way up into your dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion, which then integrates into the spinal cord segment. And this spinal cord segment will contain your interneurons. These interneurons will, one way or the other, will send information to the brain. Again, if it's a long reflex, or if it's a short reflex, it will just connect the sensory to the ventral root, which is here we have a motor neuron coming off on the ventral aspects of the spinal cord into a fiber known as a efferent fiber. So they're descending fibers into your neuromuscular junction. And at the neuromuscular junction, you will create a response, and that response is to stimulate the effector, lifting your hand from the nail. What is the stretch reflex? Stretch reflex, the example that we have in this graph, is a stimulation to the patellar ligament, and the stretch is on the patellar tendon. So when we do the knee-jerk reflex, we're actually stimulating the receptor inside the muscle spindle as it stretches out. That sends a sensory information, ascending fibers, into dorsal root ganglion, again into the spinal cord segment. And this reflex arch is a short one, which sends the information now down into a motor effector at the neuromuscular junction, and your response is to create a small kick. What is a cross reflex? What is a cross reflex? You have both a flexor and extensor, because both of them, they cross each other. So number one, what are we seeing? We're seeing that there is extensor muscle that is being stretched. This extensor will send a sensory, because it stimulates of the muscle spindle, and now as that sensory information moves up into your dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion on the basically afferent fibers, ascending fibers, to your primary efferent and alpha motor neurons on the gray matter on the spinal cord segment. From there on, you will have on the other side the cross reflex, which is a flexion. And that flexor, it will be antagonist of the one that is extending. So one muscle will extend while the other one flexes. That's a cross reflex arch. On this graph, we'll see that the cross reflex a little more simplified, and as you can see here, your pain stimuli, afferent fibers. So you have afferent fibers on the dorsal, so this is your Dave, and as the afferent fibers enter here, you have your interneuron that is either on the spinal cord that can lead all the way to the brain, and it sends a motor output. So the first one is stimulating your extensor. So the first one will be inhibiting your extensor. Well, the same motor neuron on the other side will stimulate your flexor, and by flexing, you will have a removal of the foot from the object. What is a Babinski reflex? Normally, a Babinski reflex, it's normal in infants because infants have not truly developed their central nervous system and peripheral nervous system integration. In an adult, you should not have any fanning out of your feet. In an adult, you should not have any fanned out of the toes of your feet. You should have a normal plantar reflex. So if you see a Babinski reflex in an adult individual, that is telling you automatically that this reflex is due to a damage of an upper motor neuron lesion. So what is an autonomic or visceral reflex? Autonomic is automatic. Visceral reflex is within the body. So what are some of the examples that we're going to see this and we're going to see on the future topics? So it's the regulation of the gastric activity. For example, the production and or stimulation as you see sight, smell, or taste, or think about food. That stimulation through your vagus nerve that is going to release or that is going to stimulate cells within your stomach. For example, mucus, Schiff cells, parietal cells, and G cells. To mucus cells to produce mucus, Schiff cells to produce pepsinogen, or parietal cells to make a stronger acid, hydrochloric acid, and G cells to produce gastrin. So for that autonomic or visceral reflex, you have a cephalic phase, which is the one that we just showed here, means the sight, smell, or taste. You have a vagus nerve stimulation, which is the one that connects the cephalic to the gastric phase. You also have a intestinal phase of the same, which is through the connection of your vagus nerve as seen before, and you may also have an inhibitory event of the same. So if you're preoccupied on other things, if you have a fight or flight response, a distension or a distension of the duodenum, or entry of chyme, or there is a decrease in the pH of the duodenum by chyme, then this response is kind of like a negative inhibition or inhibitory effect of all the cells listed before, which is mucus cell, Schiff, parietals, and G cells.